Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Thursday, June 6th, 2024. This is the Excerpt. Today, the latest timeline from Donald Trump's Georgia election case. Plus, we remember D-Day and how school civil rights complaints are piling up. The Georgia Court of Appeals yesterday temporarily halted the 2020 election racketeering case involving former President Donald Trump and 14 others until the appeal seeking the disqualification of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis is resolved. The ruling, which came without elaboration, issues a stay in the election subversion case until the appellate court can weigh the evidence and make a decision. The court on Monday scheduled the appeal for October 4th, strongly suggesting that the case will not be tried before the November election. Trump and 8 other defendants are seeking to overturn a ruling by Fulton County Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee, who said in March that Willis can stay on the case despite their allegations of misconduct and financial conflict of interest. He had said he would allow some trial preparations to continue while the case is appealed. In all, 19 people were charged with illegally trying to steal the election in the state in 2020 after Trump lost to President Joe Biden. Trump and 14 other remaining defendants have pleaded not guilty. 4 others have pleaded guilty and are cooperating. Trump and the other defendants petitioned to have Willis and her office removed from the case because of what they said was her improper relationship with Nathan Wade, the private lawyer Willis hired to serve as special prosecutor. Willis and Wade have acknowledged the relationship but said they did nothing wrong and that their affair began after she hired him for the job in 2021. Today marks the 80th anniversary of D-Day, when troops from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other allies landed in Normandy, France, to liberate Europe from the control of Nazi Germany. I spoke with USA Today White House correspondent Michael Collins, who is in Normandy for the anniversary. Michael, thanks for joining us from Normandy.
Greetings from France. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, you recently flew with several U.S. servicemen who were at Normandy 80 years ago on D-Day. What was their experience coming back to the place that was so pivotal in turning the war in favor of Allied forces?
Well, it was a wonderful trip. Some of these men are returning to Normandy for the first time since the war, and some of them have actually never even been to France because they flew bombing missions over France, but never actually set foot on French soil. There were 66 veterans on the flight and 2 Rosie the Riveters. Obviously, they're all a lot older now. The youngest one was 95. The oldest was 107. And so the night before we left, there was a big dinner for them in Fort Worth, Texas. The reason it was there was because American Airlines was the one that arranged this trip. Some of them actually got up and danced. They played 40s music, and they just had a wonderful time. But, one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was the age issue. These veterans, they're so old now that for many of them, this is probably the last time that they will ever make this kind of trip. These major D-Day commemorations only happen every 5 years, and given the age of some of these veterans, it just seems really doubtful that many of them will be around to see the next one.
So, Michael, how were the men received by the French?
Well, they got a wonderful welcome in France. As they got off the plane at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, there were huge lines of people waiting to see them. They were waving French and American flags. They were holding up the photos of these veterans. They were yelling, "Thank you." I saw several times that people would just step out of the crowd and just come up to these veterans as they were coming down the aisleway. They just wanted to shake their hand. There was also a very brief welcome ceremony at the airport. The U.S. ambassador to France was there. So was the former French ambassador. And I thought his remarks were particularly poignant because what he told these veterans, he thanked them again for what they did 80 years ago. And he also said that in serving your own country, you actually saved ours. And so to me, that was just a really poignant moment of this trip.
How much of a role, Michael, does D-Day and America's role in the war play in foreign policy today?
Well, I'm not so sure that it's D-Day itself that actually influences our foreign policy. It's more or less what that whole military campaign stood for. Remember, the soldiers who landed on the shores of Normandy 80 years ago, they were there because they were trying to free France from the Nazis, and they obviously did that. I think the thing that does affect U.S. policy, or at least influences it, is really kind of what happened after the war. You had these various organizations that were set up to try to make sure that, this kind of naked aggression doesn't happen again. One of probably the most prominent organizations that was set up after the war was NATO. And President Biden was born while this war was still raging. And he has been a very strong supporter of NATO. You can see that in the way that he has responded to the war in Ukraine. He pulled together a coalition of allies to stand up to Russia. And that kind of coalition building to stand up to a dictator is exactly what you saw happen in World War II on D-Day, when the U.S. and its allies banded together and they stood up to the Germans and they won. And because of what they did that day, countries like France are still free. So I think, in a sense, that is really more of the impact on foreign policy than D-Day itself. It's just what D-Day stood for, the aftermath, what happened, and those kinds of things.
Michael Collins is a White House correspondent with USA Today. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thanks again for having me. Take care.
President Joe Biden heads to Normandy today, where he's expected to double down on his support of NATO and again insist the U.S. and its allies are strongest when they stand together, like they did 80 years ago. A panel of health experts met this week to decide which vaccine the U.S. should use against COVID-19 this fall. The Federal Advisory Group decided yesterday that the new vaccine should focus on the JN.1 lineage that has dominated virus strains. Current vaccines built to fight XBB.1.5 don't provide as much protection against JN1 and several subvariants, driving cases for months, according to officials and vaccine makers during the meeting. The 16-member panel, which gathered 4 previous times since 2022, unanimously voted for a shot that would target the JN1 lineage. The FDA is expected to use the committee's recommendations to develop vaccines. The recommendations follow a similar recent assessment from the World Health Organization. School civil rights complaints are piling up, and the office tasked with dealing with them has long struggled when it comes to money and staffing. I spoke with USA Today breaking news and education reporter Zach Shermley to learn more. Zach, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks for having me, Taylor.
So, Zach, let's just start with this. I think some folks might not be familiar. What is the Office for Civil Rights, and how many school civil rights complaints is it receiving? How are things trending?
When a student or staff member at a K-12 school or college in the U.S. experiences discrimination that they think may be illegal, Taylor, they or someone who represents them can file a complaint with the Federal Education Department's Office for Civil Rights. Some people call this OCR. So the office enforces half a dozen about federal anti-discrimination laws. That includes Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. That's that sex-based discrimination law that has become something of a hot-button issue here in recent years. Then investigators at the Education Department determine whether the claims have merit. They open an investigation and they work with the school to resolve the issue, or that school can risk losing some federal funding, all federal funding, in fact, or some other consequences, including referring the case to the Justice Department. The office saw complaints rise to the highest level in its history last year, according to the agency's most recent annual report. In fiscal year 2023, the office received 19,201 complaints. That's a 2% increase from the previous year's high, which was also a record.
So, Zach, does the office have the staff or the resources to keep up with these complaints?
That's a big issue. Since 2009, the number of complaints received by the office has tripled, while the average number of full-time staff decreased by roughly 70 employees. And that tension between the office's mounting workload and retention stretches back really for decades. In the 80s, the office employed nearly 1,000 full-time staff and received just under 3,000 complaints. And in the last fiscal year, the office had about half that. Complaints, meanwhile, have ballooned by more than 6 times the amount they saw in the 80s.
So how did we get here? What led up to this point?
So like I say, complaints have trended upward for some time now, but some worry that the fallout on school campuses amid the Israel-Hamas war is what has really stressed the office to a breaking point recently. The office fielded 145 complaints based on shared ancestry discrimination, so that includes anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in the first quarter of fiscal year 2024. And to give you some context, that number was more than the last 3 fiscal years combined just in that one quarter. The Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona, has acknowledged himself publicly that the war has led to an increase in complaints that the department is really struggling to keep up with.
So then what's next? Is this a problem for Congress to solve?
Yeah, the Biden administration has requested a roughly $22 million increase in funding for the office for fiscal year 2025. That boost would support an extra 86 full-time staffers, and most of them would work directly on investigating discrimination complaints. Lawmakers in Washington right now are negotiating the next annual funding package for the department, and it's unclear whether the recent outrage over a rise in campus anti-Semitism could change the stance of some Republicans. Some of these Republicans, you have to remember, Taylor, don't think that the education department should exist at all. Both the Anti-Defamation League, though, and the Council on American Islamic Relations do support a boost in funding for the Office for Civil Rights.
All right, Zach Shermley covers breaking news and education for USA Today. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks.
The crewed Boeing Starliner has finally launched from Florida. The inaugural crewed flight for the Starliner is a major demonstration for Boeing, which hopes to join Elon Musk's SpaceX as one of 2 companies making routine trips to orbit on NASA's behalf. The mission is the first crewed orbital test flight for Boeing after 2 previous demonstrations with no astronauts on board. This time, 2 veteran NASA astronauts, Barry Butch Wilmore and Sunita Suni Williams, are finally bound for the International Space Station. That clicking noise is the sound of sperm whales communicating. Do we know what they're saying? Tune into the excerpt later today, beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when my co-host Dana Taylor sits down with David Gruber, founder and president of Project SETI, a nonprofit working to translate whale speak. You can find the episode right here on this feed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and if you're on a smart speaker, as always, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.